It's Paul. Welcome, everybody. It's absolutely lovely to see you all. I'm Alison Chapman. I'm Professor of English at the University of Victoria in the West Coast of Canada. I'm Vice President of RSVP. And one of my delightful duties as Vice President is to host the monthly digital event online sessions. And this is the first one of 2025. Um, the next one will be also exciting in February. I just want to announce this at the beginning. The next one in February is Stefan Pidgeon talking about the Institute of Journalists on the 28th of February at the same time. If you receive the RSVP newsletter, you'll have registration link there, and it's also on our socials. But today I am delighted to welcome two of the editors of the Edinburgh Companion to British Colonial Periodicals. The third editor can't be with us, Caroline Davis, but the two Davids,
Sorry, she is here, but she's a lurking partner. There we are. There you go.
I'm happy to have a lurking third editor. Thank you for the correction, David.
Yep.
But I'm delighted to welcome five contributors of the volume who are going to give short papers based on their chapters. And the event will be properly introduced and moderated by two of the editors, David Finkelstein and David Johnson. So I'm going to begin by introducing the speakers and then hand over to the two Davids, who will tell you a bit more about the volume, and then we'll proceed with five very short talks, hopefully leaving time for about a 20-minute discussion afterwards. And in the discussion, we ask you to save questions for the discussion. And when you're ready to make a comment or have a question, please put your hand up if you're comfortable doing that on Zoom. You can also type comments and responses in the chat as well. And we have some people watching the chat too. So without further ado, I'm happy to welcome again the two editors, David Finkelstein, who is the Honorary Senior Research Fellow in University College, the United Kingdom. That's UCL, I think, David?
Yeah, I've actually got an upgrade, actually. I'm an honorary professor at University College London, but there you go.
Congratulations. Congratulations.
Huge cultural capital, no actual capital, but never mind. Yeah.
Congratulations. And the second editor who will also be moderating is David Johnson, who's Emeritus Professor of Literature in the Department of English and Creative Writing at the Open University in the UK. And then we have five speakers. I'm happy to welcome Annika, who's Professor at the Centre for Women's Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University in India. And Annika is also Director of the Kerala Council for Historical Research in India. The next speaker is Prithi Joshi, who's known to us all. Prithi is the President of RSVP and the Professor of English at the University of Puget Sound in the US, just down the coast a little from me. Lize Kriel is Professor of Visual Culture Studies at the School of Arts at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. And Honor Riley has just got a new position. I want to make sure I get this right, Honor, and congratulations. Lecturer in Academic and Digital Development at the University of Glasgow.
That's the one. I think I've had about 4 different jobs in the life of this volume, but that's what I am
Many
now.
congratulations on that exciting sounding position. And finally, Candace Ward, who's Professor of English at Florida State University in the US. And so I think I'll hand over to David, who I think is going to share some slides.
I am indeed. Let's see if I
get started.
I'll get them up and running.
Thank you, everybody.
There we go. Start the slideshow. Wow, thank you very much. So lovely to see everyone. Thank you very much, Alison, for that marvelous intro. We're going to try and keep this short because I'm well allowed, only 5 minutes myself, but I'm well known to talk too much. This volume is something that came about as a result of a conversation with a brainchild of Caroline Davis, who convened David Johnson and me together and said, wouldn't it be a good idea if we did a volume that looked at the colonial periodicals, kind of synoptic, multidisciplinary, multilingual, multicultural, adding press and print culture into the mix with historical context, looking at dissemination, reception, and production. Wouldn't that be great? And we said, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. And then she said, all right, off you go then. So she started us off, and then due to health problems, took a step back, and David and I moved the project forward with her blessing and her input. And what we have now is a fantastic. I mean, we're very proud of this volume. It has 35 contributions that cover the gamut from 1820s Canadian periodicals to 1970s Hong Kong journals. And the aim was to try and bring those conversations from different disciplines together, and include a number of different languages as well. So we have a wide spread of things. And I'm going to show you, obviously, a wee table of contents just so you get a sense of what kind of areas we're talking about. We divided it up into 5 sections. The first one, creating and contesting the colonial public sphere, of whom you will hear 2 contributors discussing their pieces, Candace Ward and Lize Kriel. And then we brought in a section on women in colonial periodicals, and Anna Riley will be representing that section with her piece. Then we decided to put a section in on language and the way they fit into the British colonial periodical space. And Aroniba will be kindly offering some comments from her piece on that. We moved into the idea of thinking about trans-colonial connections and how those movements across between areas fitted in. We embarrassingly are both in this section, David and I, so we just thought, well, we'll leave that separately. And then finally, we had a section, part 5, on anti-colonialism, so looking at the anti-colonial press and how you see the movements of discussion and representation occurring in those kind of spaces. And Preeti will be offering some comments from her particular piece. And between those, I think one we found was, obviously, these are the 19th century areas that we're covering today, but you'll see that the range is quite significant in terms of looking at different periods throughout the 19th and 20th century, which in a sense covers, we hoped, a great range of the kind of space that the colonial periodical occupied and the anti-colonial periodical occupied. I'm going to now shut up and pass on to David, who will hopefully guide us through the next section, where we will have obviously little précis and snippets from our colleagues who will hopefully whet your appetite for the volume itself.
Yeah, thanks very much, David. And yeah, I suppose it's what the main idea we wanted to do is to put the colonial periodicals and anti-colonial periodicals center stage. That up until this volume and recent scholarship, they've always been seen as something you read in order to do something else, to write the history of resistance or whatever. It's the first time they've been treated in their own terms, and we've got 35 fantastic chapters trying to do just that. And the first one, David's introduced her already. The first person to talk is going to be Candace Ward. Candace's chapter, the title is The Afro-Caribbean Press and the Politics of Place in Jamaica, the Watchman and Jamaica Free Press and the Liberal. So over to you, Candace.
Thank you so much. And I just wanted to say thank you too to Allison and RSVP. RSVP's support of projects like this is absolutely incredible. And I know it personally, it has helped me enormously in developing my scholarship. And so I want to, say thank you to RSVP again. And thank you to Caroline for first extending the invitation to participate. I was thrilled to be able to accept, and then to David F. and David J. for just the meticulous editing, thoughtful, careful, made the chapter, as I'm sure the other contributors experience as well, way better than it would have been without their help and guidance. So thank you very much. My main goal in my contribution was to address a point raised in the editor's introduction, which is looking how traditionally the colonial periodical press has been looked at, and this is a quote, as unproblematized source material to support generalized statements about contemporary views of the colonial project. And I think that this was an absolutely critical point, because we tend to look too often at the archives as a source to create a litany of horrors that took place in the past. And while that is absolutely true and necessary, it also possibly does another kind of violence to the voices that we can find in the archive by neglecting or ignoring the strategies of resistance that the makers, the producers of the materials in the archive were engaging in. And so in my chapter, I had wanted to look at two examples, Edward Jordan and Robert Osborne's newspaper, The Watchman in Jamaica Free Press, and then Samuel Jackman Prescott in Barbados, his newspaper, the Liberal. And one of the things that I came to see in their newspaper content and their editorials, highly political editorials, at a moment of great transition in the Caribbean, which was for Jordan and Osborne and the Watchman, they inaugurated their paper on the eve of emancipation, the Act of 1833. They're producing materials beginning in 1829, and so really galvanizing abolition, not just in Jamaica, but in Britain and across the Atlantic, in the US as well. And then Prescott starts his paper a little bit later, but and his main target is the apprenticeship period, which was that period, that intervening period between just a nominal emancipation in beginning in 1834 to full emancipation in 1838. And so in these newspapers, we see the editors grappling with a colonial history that they invoke, try to wrest control of. And in the process, I argue, they become part of history themselves, and their visions through the editorials, through the letters to the editors, through their fights, they give us now the means to engage with that history, not as something done and finished, but as a past not past. And I don't know about you all, but here in the US, the attacks on the press are it's full onslaught. And one of the things that I think would serve us well is to look at the strategies of resistance in these colonial periodicals and take heart, for one thing, because change can be made, but also to inspire and to make a point of returning to these materials, to continually gleaning and looking both for the strategies of resistance and, by the way, the strategies of repression and oppression that the presses, their antagonists were dealing with, because we're seeing some of those same strategies at work today as well. And so I'll just close it there. Thank you.
Thanks. That's terrific, Candace. Thanks so much. Such a rich chapter. Our second speaker is Lize Kriel. Lize will talk to us now also for 5 minutes about her chapter, which was on British missionary magazines at home and abroad, Southern Africa as topic and Southern Africa as readership. Over to you, Lize.
Thank you, David. I would like to add my thanks and appreciation, like Candace had said, to the editors and also to RSVP for this opportunity. I was not the sole author of this chapter. I was privileged that I could work with two former students of mine, Annika Vosseler, who was also supervised by Adam Jones at Leipzig University, and Chantelle Finaughty, who did her master's several years ago already under the co-supervision of Jean van Eden. And I was also very fortunate that we could use this opportunity to write this chapter, also to dig into some research that was previously done, investigation into source publications, amongst others by Pat Ngadla and Stephen Voltz on Words of Botswana, which I will refer to, and also a project by a group of religious studies scholars at Munich University, who looked into discourses of indigenous Christian elites in colonial societies and in Asia and Africa, and that made the Inkanyiso Yase Natal very available for our chapter. I just want to say, if you want to navigate through this very rich volume, you can read our chapter with chapter 18, which is by Michelle Ellery on Victorian missionary periodicals, and then Janet Remington's number 19 and Corinne Sandworth's number 20 also refers to the black press in South Africa. So that can take many of the arguments we try to make here further. We take a longitudinal view and we try to argue that in the last quarter of the 19th century, missionary periodicals were quite prominent, and towards the end of that period, we see in South Africa specifically, which we focus on, that publications, periodical publications by African Christians start to see more prominence, and we try to make a connection between those two. And what we say is that by the first decade of the 20th century, the offspring of 19th century missionary periodicals in the British colonies had become so prominent in their own right that the concepts of home and abroad could actually be inverted. And we do this by referring to a number of examples. We first give an introduction to what the British missionary society presence in South Africa looked like, and there we refer to Geoffrey Cox's work and emphasize that for many people in Britain, Cox says most people, if in the 19th century they knew something about foreign cultures, they received their basic information most probably from missionary periodicals. But when we also argue that if you look at the Methodist example, this is what Chantelle Finaughty's work was about, these periodicals are also, as much as they show a curiosity in Britain itself for the world abroad, it is also very much about British Christians grooming their sense of self. But then how did it happen that this kind of publication from the missionary societies to their supporters in Britain had an effect on the press in South Africa itself? There we give two examples. The one comes from the work of Annika Vosseler, where she looked at the Chronicle of the London Missionary Society, and if you juxtapose that with the Mahoko a Botswana, or the Words of Botswana, which were published between 1883 and 1896 in South Africa, you see that the Chronicle reports back to supporters in Britain, but the Mahoko a Botswana is locally printed by the London Missionary Society, and it gives an opportunity for Botswana converts, Christians, to voice their own views. The other example comes from Lovedale, where there was a periodical published from 1870 until 1876 named the Isigidimi Samaxhosa, and within 6 years, this attempt to bring together colonial Christian and African Christian views separated. The Xhosa version continued for another few years. It died a sad death in 1884, but the English version became the Christian Express, which became more generally a missionary newspaper for South Africa. And in 1922, it became the South African Outlook, which became the mouthpiece for the General Missionary Conference and the precursor of the South African Council of Churches, having a mixed Christian voice. And then our last example is from the Inkanyiso Yase Natal, founded in 1889 by white missionaries, of the CPSA in the Natal colony, but it goes over into black ownership in 1895. It only exists for 8 years, but what this periodical does is to take views from many different parts of the world. In these 8 years, we found references to 100+ periodicals from around the world, and they rebroadcast these views. And what they wanted to do with this paper, they wanted to give a voice to the Africans in the colony, but also to acquaint the white population of Natal of their thoughts, to promote better understanding between the two groups. And you also find several instances in these periodicals, of this specific one, where the broader world is addressed and the African voice is broadcast back to Britain. I think I've run out of time, but I can stop there.
No, thanks so much, Lisa. That's fascinating. I was just glancing at the first sentence of your chapter, and a reminder that 40% of all periodicals in the 19th century were Christian missionary periodicals. The extent to which they were dominant is so important. So moving on to the third talk, we've got Anna Riley coming up now, representing part 2, Women in Periodicals. Anna, if you want to talk to your chapter, which is Transnational Reprinting in the Colonial Women's Magazine, the Montreal Museum, 1832 to 1834.
Will do. Thank you, David. I'm afraid I do have more slides than my compatriots. David, will I just sort of sing out when I want you to move them on? I'll do that.
Just
okay.
Go ahead. No, you're fine.
We'll zip through them, I promise. So, as David mentioned, my chapter looks at the Montreal Museum, which ran for 15 issues only between December 1832 and March 1834. The museum is, as far as I've ever been able to establish, the first British colonial periodical to be pitched at a female readership and the first to have a female editor. This editor's name was Mary Graddon Gosselin. She was born into an Irish merchant family in Quebec City, and in 1830 she married a French-Canadian lawyer and journalist called Léon Gosselin and moved to Montreal, where she launches this magazine a couple of years later. So we see on the slide here, Mrs. L. Gosselin is the editor. So to generalize somewhat, and in 5 minutes, I have to generalize, scholarship on early 19th century Canadian periodicals has tended, very understandably, to focus on the original content of these magazines. And if there isn't much, then on the reasons for and the implications of, that lack of original material. And I do a little bit of that myself in this chapter, and I'm looking at how Gosselin expresses a kind of a proto-nationalist, maybe, concern with the cultural development of Lower Canada, now Quebec, but at the same time, how she's soliciting Canadian content of a very specific character that fits her vision of her magazine as women's magazine specifically. But the main focus of this chapter is really attribution research, a type of research that I know many RSVP members will also be engaged in. So I was able to identify the source of all but 5 of the 139 reprinted sources in volume 1 of the museum, as against 47 original pieces. So that's the kind of ratio. And the central premise that I was working with really is that when we look beyond the original content and examine the material that colonial periodicals are taking from elsewhere, that this is when we can really start to complicate the narrative, a unidirectional flow of influence from metropole to colony that we might initially have been gravitating towards. So in the rest of this lightning talk, I'm just going to very quickly share a few brief examples of these many routes of reprinting that I find to be fanning outwards from the pages of the museum. So next slide, please, David. Thank you. So like many 19th century editors, Gosselin's approach to attribution is inconsistent, patchy, sometimes absent, and very often conceals the extent of her reliance on a particular source for a particular number of her magazine. So the 10th issue, which I've got up here, for example, includes these 3 prose excerpts and 1 poem. The Lady Morgan piece has a brief attribution to Ath, and Imogene's poem is also attributed to London Athenaeum in the table of contents, although not in the issue itself. Next slide. In fact, all 4 pieces are from the Athenaeum. And the date range that we see here, I think, tracks with the fact that the weekly numbers of the Athenaeum were bundled into monthly installments for the international market. So she probably just got all of these at the same time. So where does that kind of leave me? Doesn't this simply confirm that the museum's even more dependent on a small number of London periodicals than we might initially have realised once we sort of dig in? Well, this wasn't the only thing that my data revealed to me, or otherwise this would be a kind of short chapter. One really significant aspect of the museum's reprinting practice that's often elided by Gosselin's lack of clear attribution is the full extent of her engagement with the American periodical press. Next slide. So the 8th issue features this set of short snippets whose sources appear to include the London Penny Magazine and the Monthly Magazine. However, the only publication in which all of these pieces appear in close proximity is, next slide, the Family Magazine of New York. And the first 2 pieces, in fact, appear side by side in this magazine. So again, this pattern is suggesting that Gosselin has obtained a couple of months' worth of copies of this new American periodical, and she's mined it for content for her own magazine. So when the source is the London Athenaeum, we might interpret this extensive borrowing through the lens of colonial dependency, but it's difficult, I think, to view the American reprint economy in quite the same light, which suggests that it's probably just more productive to see the whole process, as a more of a horizontal than a hierarchical one. And one thing that emerges very clearly from reading through the museum is that Gosselin sees the sphere in which she's operating as a female editor as a transnational one that extends across the southern border as well as across the Atlantic. And when she does cross the Atlantic, it's not just to London. Next slide. And this is my final example, and it's a quicker one. So there are 27 translations from French in the Montreal Museum. This interest in French literature is very unusual, I think, in fact, unique for an English-Canadian magazine of this period. The translations include 3 stories from this anthology, Paris ou le livre des 101, Paris or the Book of the 101. Next slide. One of the 3 is Gosselin's own original translation for the museum, as I've highlighted here. Next slide. Final slide. However, the other 2 are not original. They come from her perennial source, the Athenaeum, which published the first English translations of excerpts from this work when they reviewed it. So this text, the single French text, is connecting Gosselin to Paris, yes, but also to London. So things get very complicated. So to wrap up, I think what we see here is many things. The interconnectedness of the practices of reprinting and translation, it's quite difficult to pull them apart from one another. We also see a colonial editor really maximizing a limited set of sources in some very complex ways that further break down any easy distinction we might want to be drawing between original and unoriginal content. And I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Anna. That's it's really interesting. I was thinking as you were talking how easily your chapter could also have come in the next section, the part that talks about transcolonial connections, because that's so central to the kind of relationships you're describing and how the periodical functions. The next talk we're going to have is by Arunima, who's in the section on language and colonial periodicals. Her chapter is on language and the making of the colonial modern periodicals from late 19th century Kerala, India. Over to you, Arunima.
Thanks, David. At the outset, thank you to all the editors. Thank you to the organizer. Thank you to the participants. Who are clearly very interested in the colonial periodical. And I must say, I'm one of those people who's guilty of having used periodicals for writing other things. So I'm happy I had this opportunity to think about the form of the periodical and also the kinds of discussions and so on. So let me jump in quickly and tell you a little bit about this. One, of course, in the course of thinking about this, I discovered how central periodicals are to the making of the print public sphere and the kinds of discussions that sort of emerge from that. And there are lots of things that can be said about that. But, for this very brief presentation, let me just focus on one theme that I chose from 2 periodicals, Bhasha Poshani and Vidya Vinodini. Bhasha Poshani still exists in Kerala. So it's had a very long run. And I look at the decade of the 1880s, so from 1880s to 1890s, where the big raging debate is on the central, to think about Malayalam, the language of the region, and many issues about that. And it's fascinating because it marks a kind of departure from an earlier kind of literary culture when people, especially cultural elites, caste elites, were the ones who actually controlled writing. And what you had was a slightly floral kind of poetry and poetic forms. So you have a shift to prose. You have the entry of new kinds of participants in a kind of literary public sphere. So you have very new kinds of writers and new kinds of readers. I mean, periodicals do have a longer history, and so do newspapers in Malayalam. They start from the early 19th century at least the ones that we know about and those which have actually survived. But the kinds of themes that I saw coming up repeatedly in these several issues of these 10 years is really, one, of course, is about the history of the language. And the history of the language is sort of, it goes into other kinds of, questions. So the language question also becomes a question about culture and caste. So language becomes a means of thinking about other kinds of identities. And the cultural question is actually very serious, because the repeated kind of refrain that you get in this period is, how do you think about a Malayali, the person who speaks the language Malayalam? And this is interesting because Kerala has a history of several religions, at least 4 of the main world religions. Apart from that, it was immensely caste stratified, and there was enormous amounts of caste violence. So in the context of that, it is interesting that there is a new kind of linguistic identity that is being formed in this period, which is seen as overriding these differences. It's not that those go away, but that is one of the kinds of ways in which this reimagination is actually taking place. And I think what we actually find from that is a kind of way by which this language question, the debate about the modernity of being Malayali, being a Malayalam speaker, and so on and so forth, is actually allowing for a more inclusive way of actually inhabiting this region and inhabiting this space. And it's also, I think, striking, given that India is a multilingual country and has very many rich and diverse histories of language. It is also, I think, significant that there are particular kinds of regional iterations of questions that are actually important. It's not that the national is being mirrored in the regional. It's really that the region is producing certain kinds of questions. There's certain ways in which these new entrants, these new practitioners, if you wish, into the new sort of literary world are actually changing the kinds of stakes in how you think about yourself and how you think about your presence in the region. So in time, this will actually lead to sort of political questions. So there's a kind of cultural politics which is already being sort of created in this period. And I think that the periodical is the site where much of this is actually happening. And finally, I just want to touch on something completely different, which is the emergence of the essay as a form. And I found that actually really very interesting because, there is a sort of coming together, if you wish, of a very different kind of prose style. There's demotic prose, which is, of course, very different from Sanskritized poetry and so on. There's polemical writing and a very new form of argumentation. So you have a very different kind of, shall we say, there are, I think it offers us a way to think about how modern Malayalam, if you wish, becomes a vehicle for thinking about new kinds of cultural and political self-fashioning. All right, let me stop there.
That's great. Thanks so much. Really so interesting. Then move on to our final talk, which is from part 5. We were quite eager to move across, the conventional division between colonial and post-colonial. We were quite keen to run themes through that division, and one of them was the theme of resistance. And so we have several chapters in that section from the colonial period and from the period coming up to decolonization. And the first chapter in that section is pretty Joshi's chapter, for illustrative purposes only, Nana Sahib, Jyoti Prasad, and representation in British and Anglo-Indian newspapers. So over to you, Prissy.
Thanks so much. I have been known to go on, so I'm going to read my paper, so I stay to my 5 minutes. This paper emerged from my desire to address 2 questions and to disentangle or not. The first question is, how much did Britons in the 19th century know about their star colony, India? Historians have debated this question for a long time, from didn't care at all, knew a great deal, everybody had a child there, to a fit of absent-mindedness. The second question that I was interested in is did or how well did information and news circulate between Britain and India? And the knot I wanted to untangle was whether 19th century Britons were of one mind about India. In this chapter, I focus on a triangulated relationship that teases out differences between 2 sets of Britons, Britons in Britain and Britons in India, and Indians. I hone in on newspapers, some printed in London, others in India, some steamship journals that were figuratively in between or formed a print bridge, as it were, between Calcutta and London. I tackle these questions by taking as my case study representations, and that's really a key word for me in this chapter, of Nana Sahib, the most reviled man in India for his role in the massacre of British men and women during the 1857 uprising. On September 26, 1857, 2 images of Nana Sahib appeared in London newspapers. The first, thank you, David, is from the Illustrated London News, and the second, slide please, is from its rival newspaper, the Illustrated Times. As the most cursory of glance, next slide please, David. As the most cursory of glances will show, the men represented in these images could not be more different. Yet, so far as I have been able to discover, not a single person or newspaper noticed or commented that these were in fact different men. 6 years later, 1863, an English language newspaper from India, the Vosseler, carried a small notice. The paper was edited by an Australian, John Lang, who bounced back and forth between utter contempt for the British government in India. He went so far as to represent an Indian against the East India Company in the first case of its kind. So Lang bounced back and forth between contempt for the British government in India and a puppy dog desire to be noticed by Britons such as Dickens. In 1863, in the Vosseler, his Indian newspaper, Lang related that at the start of the uprising, the editor of the ILN, Herbert Ingram, visited him in London, where he happened to be, and asked if he, Lang, had a portrait of Nana Sahib. Lang relates that he didn't have one, but Ingram's eye fell upon a portrait that Lang had of his client, one of his clients. Lang was also an attorney. Ingram wondered if, quote, it would not do duty for Nana Sahib. Lang responded, well, it might in this country, and chuckled that shortly thereafter the image of a man he had previously represented in court, quote, was all over the United Kingdom and shipped to every part of the civilized world, end quote, as that of Nana Sahib. Lang's 1863 account was reprinted in numerous colonial papers, the Bombay-based Times of India, the Melbourne Herald, the Steamship Journal, Homeward Mail from India, China, and the East, as an amusing anecdote about, quote, the gullibility of the British public and Lang's, quote, joke at the expense of the London press. Britons living and serving in India appeared to know of the hoax and the switcheroo, but none mentioned it because a misrepresented Indian did not matter. The circulation of printed material between Britain and India was quite robust. Those steamship journals were efficient and Lang's account was quickly circulated, but representing colonial subjects was a low priority. One form of representation that did matter, however, quickly became clear. The 2 London papers went to court over copyright, with the Illustrated Times, and that's the image on the left, suing the proprietor of the ILN for stealing its wood-engraved image of Nana Sahib. And that image is not here. You'll have to look in the book for that image, so a little teaser there. While the men represented didn't matter, newspapers' intellectual property rights did. The final sense of representation I uncovered is a curious footnote. The man whose image Lang passed off as that of Nana Sahib, and that's the image on the right, his name was Jyoti Prasad, sued Lang for libel, which is, of course, a legal suit for misrepresentation. In this anecdote, dominated by inter-British rivalry and schoolboy fun, we can trace faintly the voice of at least one colonized man who was misrepresented but tried to use legal means to reverse that representation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ruti. Amazing the contrast between those 2 images, that nobody spotted them and all those people reading them. It is an amazing piece of research. It's time to open up for questions. Either raise your hand, or if you'd like me to read out your question, feel free to type it into the message, into the chat box. We can ask our speakers to respond. And perhaps, I don't know, there's always an awkward silence at this point, and it's up to the chair to try and think of how to fill it. Just while we were talking, I was struck by Arunima repeating what I'd said at the beginning, how, you know, we previously 20, 30 years ago read these periodicals because we were interested in other stuff, and the periodicals were a means to an end. And I was just wondering whether any of the speakers had thoughts on how the status of the periodical now in our sort of historiographical thinking has changed, whether it has a certain agency now that we would never have attributed to it before, whether people see the periodical functioning in the historical moment as part of that history in an active way, not simply as mediating other stuff. I see Pretty's hand go up there, yeah.
It was funny. I was going to start by saying something about that in my comments, David, that notion that we now see periodicals on their own terms, not as source materials for something else. But when you do that, I find myself, you get into an awful lot of detail. So as I was trying to write this paper or put together these notes for 5 minutes, I found myself having to big picture question, and the details wash away. And so I actually think what I presented to you all right now isn't about periodicals as a genre, but my essay is, but it's filled with details about networks and connections and things. And so it's a tension for me, and I don't know how to answer it, but I think it's a really important question for us to think about, and I'd love to hear from others.
Yeah, do other speakers want to come in? I suppose I was thinking straight away whether we could be in danger, because we all love books and we all love ideas and we all like reading stuff, and we can consume all our hours reading periodicals. We can forget sometimes that most of the people in these colonies were illiterate and weren't reading them, and that there are large parts of colonial history that are outside of a reading and public sphere. And is there a way of kind of acknowledging that? Because that obviously is part of how we're trying to understand those moments as the people who are excluded from it. So there's so many questions that are provoked by a shift in emphasis. It's, I think, always as you move into a different paradigm and a different way of thinking, new silences or new questions arise. Sorry, I can't see hands going up.
Arunima has her hand up.
Lovely, thanks. Thanks, David.
We might need digital hands so we could actually see them. That's one of the things.
I can't see hands, so people better maybe just jump in.
I can't find this. There is a setting for digital hands, but I can't seem to find it. Anyway, I just wanted to say that, it's really interesting that many of us who work on literary cultures focus on novels, and, there is a way in which we look at other kinds of literature, what we treat as literature, and work with that. And I haven't really seen the periodical being thought about as a kind of site for us to think about historical change or contestation or any of these kinds of things, even though it was far more read. So it is an interesting, and I think that myopia really is the historians, rather than the fact that it didn't have a role to play. It certainly did. And the kinds of investments that went into that, the kinds of people who funded these things. I mean, I've just found a huge world of early 20th century periodicals, and it's really fascinating how these were sort of coming up, even if they didn't have long runs. So it's an interesting issue, actually. Though I don't see it, at least within Indian historiography, at least the kinds of things that I do, I haven't really seen it being treated in a different kind of way as...
No, that's right. I mean, I was really struck in your chapter about the linguistic nationalism you spoke about, or regional kind of linguistic regional identities that were being generated by those periodicals, and how, again, I'd never read anybody really thinking about them in those terms, which was, again, so interesting. I don't want to talk too much, though. Candace, your hand's up.
I was thinking about two things. I mean, one of the questions that, and I'm sorry, I don't remember David F, if it was you or David J who raised the question in a round of the proofs or editing, was about readership, and that who was reading the papers. And one of the ironies is that you have to dig into the periodical to try to kind of suss out well, who was reading it. So letters to the editor are really helpful. And, just these allusions. And one of the things that I've found, the more I engage with periodicals in the way that, that you say as a site of these contests, is that now I have to think back to material I worked with as the means to an end, to think, oh, you know what? I used this little snippet to do this, but I want to go back now and put that snippet in this bigger context to tease out some of those meanings. So it's really changed for me. This process has really changed the way that I look at materials.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks. Anna, you're...
Yeah, I was just wanting to pick up perhaps on what Candace was saying about the question of the reader. And certainly I know that you two came back to me with a similar question about readership, and it was very difficult really for me to determine. And partly then what we have to do, is you're suggesting, Candace, is think about, well, who's the implied reader or the desired reader? So I was thinking of an example of this that might be a way to get us to Andrew's question in the chat, if that is okay, David. Will I just, because it's kind of an answer to that as well. Were there any themes, patterns, connections, that surprised you? And what I was sort of trying to get at very hastily at the end of my talk was that the engagement with French literature surprised me. But what also surprised me was the ways in which French literature and French society closer to Gosselin was not engaged with. So this is an Anglophone magazine, even though she's married to a French-Canadian man who's actually the editor of a French language newspaper. At the same time, they have the same printer. This is probably how she's able to do this. And so thinking about that question of who they want their readers to be, there's a moment very early in the run of the Montreal Museum where Gosselin solicits French language contributions. She wants them. She wants it to be a bilingual magazine, but this just doesn't happen. She says, I'll print these in French and I'll translate them. And we see that she is able to translate. She's bilingual. But this doesn't happen, and there are various explanations we might offer for why it doesn't happen. In the 1830s, we're getting this kind of cultural, perhaps kind of separation or hardening between these groups. So then what surprised me was the way in which she leverages her own identity as someone who's bilingual is to engage with Parisian literature, and to sort of bring that to her readers rather than printing Francophone literature that's being produced, in the colony. But the kind of original content focus, that would simply be an absence, whereas I guess when you're looking at the non-original material, it's then a presence of a different kind, So again, that's like getting very into the weeds, sorry. But when I saw Andrew's question, I thought maybe that was a way to pivot us to that as well.
No, that's a really, really interesting response. And I suppose that, it depends how we answer. It'll depend on which periodicals we read. But Andrew, one thing it's a really terrific question. One thing that struck, I think, all of us, or certainly David and I, was the extent to which people in different colonies around the world knew so much about other places and about the rest of the empire. And it was very much what drove our desire to have a section on transcolonial connections. So that, for example, one of the chapters is about a periodical in India writing and covering in great detail the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879, and using that Anglo-Zulu War as a way of writing a critique of what was happening in India. So that when you look at in this kind of, it's the sort of evidence that will emerge only when you look at a kind of in a comparative way, like this collection. You'll suddenly see that there were connections that were you to be sticking to your own little patch, you'd never realized were there at all. And I suppose, as well as those parallels and the communication across the colonies, I suppose, and potential networks of readers that develop, you were also getting often moments of miscommunication and misunderstanding each other. So it's very attractive, and I think we can all be seduced by the idea that there were networks of resistance that were transcontinental, international socialists joining hands and fighting imperialism. We all want to believe that. But often when you read the detail of the different colonies and the anti-colonial struggles, they misunderstanding each other, misconstruing each other, projecting what they want to see quite often. So it requires a really careful, close reading skills come into it as well, and being very scrupulous about not projecting our sort of what we want to find onto the primary material, because they're always surprises. They really are.
I think
and not what you're expecting to find. David probably wants to come in as well. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I was going to add to that, Dave, by mentioning that there were two things that I think were quite interesting from the perspective of the chapters looking at. One was the idea that, as Preeti and Honor have kind of demonstrated, the idea of the scissor and paste and exchange journalism, borrowing that gets brought over into another journal in another country. So you see that flow, which I think has been started to be picked up by the various digital projects that have now picked up newspapers and digitized them and seen that connection of articles and news flowing across borders and across space and time. The second thing I think was, and something that was brought up in your chapter, David, about the Atlantic Charter, the idea that themes get picked up and brought across different spaces and looked at. So, for example, you were looking at the Atlantic Charter and how that was examined by a number of different journals in different spaces and colonial spaces. And yet you're pointing out that the themes were similar and the responses, some were same and some were different, but they nevertheless were motivated by a similar interaction around a common theme. And I think that's one of the things that is also very common from what I've seen from the periodicals that we were looking at, is precisely that themes keep coming up and keep being re-examined in the colonial space that they are being examined within, but also connecting to other colonial spaces in that way, which I thought was fascinating.
Lisa, I saw you start typing. I was wondering whether you could come in and say something about the sort of the missionary Christian sort of universe of periodicals, which was, so ubiquitous and presumably, again, communicating from colony to colony.
I must just say this is also one of the fascinating things of this project, that one is forced to rethink and reconfigure ways in which you think about your niche, and it's very helpful for me also to see the missionary periodicals alongside all other kinds of periodicals. And of course, the missionary project was a transnational and a universal project. They wanted to spread towards the ends of the earth, and they were not supposed to have had boundaries between different governments and empires. Missionaries in Germany and missionaries in London were supposed to collaborate. So there was, at least initially, and I think Annika Vosseler shows this in her work, and an openness and a willingness to share. And they felt that when they reported on projects in other parts of the world, that it's still part of the same bigger project. What I do find interesting is, perhaps more than other periodicals, the missionary periodicals were, of course, very interested in local voices. They concocted it in all kinds of ways and distorted it. So you have to peel back many layers if you want to try and find something. But the extent to which they wanted to give voice to what they saw happening on the ground, I think, is reflected in the extent to which people are interested in missionary periodicals now as a potential source for tracing traditional leadership succession disputes or land disputes in the country. They somehow feel that these missionary periodicals have the truth, which is, of course, not the case. We're actually trying to move away from mining the periodicals for content. But I noticed from the conversation and from the parts I've read in the volume so far that this is something, I think, interesting about missionary periodicals specifically.
Thanks very much, Lisa. There was one other question I wanted to squeeze in. I think we've got to stop. We were allocated 20 minutes, so probably time for a quick one. I was struck, I was looking at everybody's sort of CVs online this afternoon. I was preferring to introduce people, and then I didn't need to because Alison kindly did so anyway. But I was noticing quite a few of our speakers, Candace and I think Preeti as well, and Narunima, I think, have also people who've worked in English departments and have written about novels. And how novels have tended to take, or literary works have taken center stage, and how periodicals have been, you'd read them if you wanted to find reviews and that, and how people might have done those kinds of books. I noticed Candace especially did Creole novels. Now moving on to study periodicals in their own right. I was just wondering, just a final question is, what can a periodical teach us that a novel can't? Does it have something more interesting, more revealing? I don't know if anybody has anything to say about that. Candace, I was looking at your book on Google Books, especially. It looked so interesting.
I think one of the things that I see in the periodic, I mean, first I do absolutely employ the same kinds of reading practices, that kind of close reading,
yeah,
deep dive on a sentence by sentence level to the periodicals. But the periodicals, there's a pace and a kind of immediacy, which makes sense in a newspaper. But in these periodicals, there's a kind of an intimacy. And again, it's a kind of a weird intimacy because it's meant to be broadcast and circulated, and the scissors and paste kind of journalism going on. Maybe many tentacled. That's where I'll leave it. That isn't quite so evident in the novels, which I found intriguing.
Yeah. Thanks. Pretty, do you want to come in there? Or anybody else got their hand up? I don't know.
Well, I think Honor had her hand up. So Honor, go first.
Honor, come in. Yeah. Sorry.
What I was going to say, perhaps just speaking from the context of working on 19th century Canada, is that so again, this is a big generalization, but it's also true, is that a lot of the scholarship, again, on the literary sphere in 19th century Canada had focused on, a sense of belatedness, on so to give one example, the fact of Walter Scott remaining so popular in the colony long after he's no longer popular, and this sort of temporality that we're probably very familiar with. And working on periodicals just makes that impossible to sustain. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't hold together. Almost everything that's being published in these magazines is extremely contemporary, is extremely recent. That's the sort of orientation of these periodicals, and when something isn't, it probably still kind of is. So one of the weirdest items I found in this magazine was one of Wordsworth's lyrical ballads, which does fit that, 30-year time lag, my goodness. No, she's including it because it's recently been published in a Philadelphia miscellany. So it is, to her, it is recent, that sort of wanting to think about Canada as a site that has a kind of, contemporary relation, with Britain, with the US, with whatever. I think the periodicals really kind of like invaluable for that.
Thanks.
I'll just quickly say, like Candace, I am a literary scholar in an English department, but I'm not, I teach literature, but I don't write about it. So the methods are the same, but I actually want to say something a little, for me, periodicals, when I study periodicals, I actually never read the literature in them. I never read the poetry. I never read the fiction, because I'm like, who cares?
That's all I
do. But what I think, here's how, for me, newspapers and periodicals are the spaces that do what the realist novel tries to represent. They have a polymorphousness. They have, to use the word we use today, multimodality, that the novel is trying to capture, the realist novel is trying to capture. So for me, to use another term that the historian Michel Rolfe Trio uses, or others have too, they're the first draft of history. They're the first draft of the novel, the realist novel itself. So that's where my sort of training as a literary scholar comes in. I approach them like a realist novel, except they're crafted by, many different voices and things like that. So I don't know if that analogy is quite working, but.
Yeah. Alison, do you want to come in there?
Well, I wish we had time for me to have a discussion about literary content of periodicals, but I'm going to suggest that might be a wonderful topic for another digital event. We are at the end of the hour, and I'm reluctant to bring this brilliant discussion to a close, but I must. I want to thank you all for amazing talks, a brilliant book, fantastic discussion. And I can't wait to read this companion. It does seem to me that you're offering a new approach to the study of periodicals and history, and also how to do this at different kinds of scale, both in terms of detail and in terms of like wider angle and everything in between. So thank you so much for a terrific event. Congratulations on the book. And thanks to everybody for coming. Delighted to see you all here. Next event is on the 28th of February. Hope to see you then when Stefan Pidgeon's talking about the Institute of Journalists.